Yet this is held true by the wise of Eressëa, that all those of the Quendi who came into the hands of Melkor ere Utumno was broken, were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the Orcs in envy and mockery of the Elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. For the Orcs had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Iluvatar, and naught that had life of its own, nor the semblance of life, could ever Melkor make since his rebellion in the Ainulindalë before the beginning. So say the wise. And deep in their dark hearts, the Orcs loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. This, it may be, was the vilest deed of Melkor, and the most hateful to Iluvatar. Greetings and well met, my friends. Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be taking another updated look at the Orcs of Middle-earth, and more specifically, their descriptions, peoples, and histories. As I typically like to do, there will be some related articles and videos in the description and cards above that helped with the creation of today's video. And since today's is such a broad topic, please check these out for more information. A big shout out to Tolkien Gateway for their gathered information. It really helped a lot with this topic, as broad as it is. On that note, I will summarize much of what there is to know about the Orcs, rather than going into detail on everything, otherwise this video might go on for hours without end. Now, without further delay, let us begin our tale about the Orcs of Middle-earth. We shall begin with the early history of the Orcs. After the awakening of the Elves in Cuivanian during the Years of the Trees, the Vala Orome and his steed Nahar came upon the Elves or Quendi in ancient times, and thus the Valar had discovered the firstborn children of Iluvatar. Orome had loved the Elves, but due to the deceptions of Melkor in those elder days, many of the Quendi came to fear the riding of Orome. This was because of the evil shadows and spirits that Melkor had sent forth in the years ere the coming of Orome, and whenever these spirits came across elves far astray alone or together, they would be ensnared and vanished from their people, never to be seen again. The elves thought that the hunter had gotten them, and that was Melkor's plan, for he feared and hated Orome, and wished for the elves to shun Orome should he ever come across them. Melkor had either sent out his dark servants as riders, or he had sent out rumors far off to make this happen. And so when Orome did come across the elves, some of the Quendi hid, while others fled and were lost. But some stayed and were drawn to Orome, but those who weren't had a far darker fate at hand. Little is truly known what happened to these elves, but the wise of Tol Eressëa believe that all elves who went to Melkor before the destruction of his ancient fortress Utumno were imprisoned, enslaved, and corrupted. And thus the vile race of orcs came to be, made in mockery of the firstborn children of Iluvatar. Again, Melkor could not create life on his own, for he did not have the flame imperishable, the secret fire, which was life and free will. Only Iluvatar had such fire to give. But Melkor could create mockeries of the thoughts of other beings. The creation of orcs was perhaps the greatest sin of Melkor towards Iluvatar. And thus the orcs came into being. They seemed to be wholly evil and corrupted creatures who could not be turned to good. Tolkien played around with the idea of the origins of orcs, for an older theory saw them as made from subterranean heat and slime, according to the Book of Lost Tales Part 2, while another theory envisioned them as more animalistic, and even according to Christopher Tolkien and Morgoth's Ring, it's possible that Tolkien began to feel uncomfortable with the idea that orcs were descended from elves, but it was never changed. Thus, I would say that the most canonical idea is that which is represented in the published Silmarillion concerning the orcs. That being that there were mutilated mockeries of and from elves. They were cruel and terrible creatures, and looked as one might imagine them. They were fearsome and ugly to look upon, brandishing terrible teeth, armor, and weapons. They were generally smaller in stature than men, and they were strong, but crooked and bow-legged, with long arms. However, the appearance of these fell creatures differed in some ways, such as flesh tones and others. Orcs in general seemed weakened by the sun, as indicated in the Hobbit and the Two Towers, but they could continue to run even with weaker legs and giddy heads, under the light of the sun. Uruk-hai would be more resistant to the sun though, but we'll talk more about that later. To keep their strength, they would drink orc draught, and although it was not fulfilling, it would keep them going. They used a language called Orcish, which was a term for the jumble of languages and debased black speech that was used by orcs, but they would also use common speech for cross-tribe and general communication. As for their lifespans, it's possible that they were immortal like elves, or they just lived long lives, as some orcs, such as Bolg, son of Azog, lived to be very old. Now the etymology of orcs is fascinating, as it seems to have come from the Old English word orc, meaning demon or monster. In Sindarin they were called Glamhoth, meaning the din horde, or yelling horde, and Urk, or orc. In Quenya they were called Orkor, in Khazd-dûl Rakhas, or Gorgun in the Druidan language. Other languages had other names as well. Now, a big debate in this topic is whether or not goblins and orcs are different, or rather if they are synonyms for the same beings. Now, I've always been torn on this debate, so I'm curious to hear what you all have to say in the comments below, but I agree with what Tolkien Gateway says on the matter. Goblin was typically used in The Hobbit, but also in The Lord of the Rings, where it seemed to be synonymous with orc. I also think that hobbits in general call them goblins, as Gulfimble of Mount Graham, who fought the hobbits in the Battle of Greenfields, is referenced as such. Hobbits, who typically used more updated English, called them goblins, while the Rohirrim, whose speech was more akin to Old English, called them orcs. So I tend to think goblins are synonyms for the same species, but the former is a newer English word, while the latter is an older English word. For more on my thoughts about the connection between the speech of the hobbits and Rohirrim, please check out my How Did Hobbits Come to Be Middle-earth Explained video. But what do you all think about the orc-goblin debate? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, getting back to the lore now, there were different kinds of orcs. There were the typical Orcs of Melkor or Morgoth who originated in Utumno and Angband, and the Orcs of Sauron who came from Mordor. These served in the armies of the Dark Lords, and Sauron continued his master's traditions of breeding them and making them stronger even in the Third Age. Likely the Witch King knew these methods of creating orcs, for he had orcs in Angmar and Minas Morgul, and Saruman learned these methods to create orcs and Uruk-hai of Isengard. Amongst these kinds of orcs in the service of evil were the Snaga, derived from the black speech word meaning slave, and they were lesser and weaker orcs amongst the others. There were also orcs called Snufflers, who were smaller creatures with wide nostrils that excelled in tracking. Besides the orcs who served in the armies of the Dark Lords, there were also orcs in the Misty Mountains, such as those who lived in Goblin Town or those who had claimed Mount Gundabad and Moria for themselves. Besides having allegiance to Azog and Bolg, or the Great Goblin, they typically did nothing more than harass those who entered their domains. Hobgoblins was a name for larger kinds of orcs found in Middle-earth. And then there were the Uruk-hai, or orc folk in black speech, and they were a strong, large, and red-eyed breed, originally made by Sauron, and then also by Saruman in the late Third Age. Sauron's Uruk-hai first appeared in about 2475 of the Third Age, when they took Ithilien and destroyed Osgiliath. Saruman would eventually take and further strengthen the Uruk-hai in the late Third Age, and they would fight against Rohan in the Battle of Helm's Deep. Again, they could better withstand the sun more than orcs, but they still did not like the sun. Finally, we have the half-orcs and goblin men. According to Morgoth's Ring, men and orcs mixed back in the First Age, but half-orcs and goblin men were primarily employed by Saruman after his fall to evil in the late Third Age, and they came under his banner during the Battle of Helm's Deep, and they even came to mix in with his ruffians who went north into Bree and the Shire. Besides these different kinds of orcs, there were also many places in which the orcs lived that divided them and made them different. For instance, the Battle of Cirith Ungol took place between the orcs of Cirith Ungol and the orcs of Minas Morgul. We can assume that the orcs differed from one another based on where they lived. Before we move on to the summarized history of the orcs, I should mention some of the more important named orcs in the works. Gulfimble was the leader of the orcs from Mount Graham who attacked the Shire during the Battle of Greenfields in 2747 of the Third Age. He was slain by Bandobras or Bolroer Took, and according to a legend, Bolroer hit Gulfimble's head 100 yards through the air with a club, and it landed in a rabbit hole, and thus the game of golf was invented. Azog, chieftain of the Orcs of Moria, slew King Thror and initiated the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, during which he was slain in 2799 of the Third Age by Dain Ironfoot and his Red Axe. His son Bolg would lead the Orc army during the Battle of Five Armies in 2941 of the Third Age, and Bolg would be slain by Beorn. The Great Goblin of Goblintown would be slain by Gandalf and his sword Glamdring after capturing Thorn's company in 2941 of the Third Age as well. Grishnach was a captain of orcs from Mordor who was a part of Ugluk's party, Ugluk being another notable orc, that had captured Merry and Pippin during the battle at Parth Galen after the breaking of the Fellowship in 3019 of the Third Age. Both Grishnach and Ugluk met their ends near the eaves of the Fangorn Forest by Eomer's band of Rohirrim. Gothmog, who fought in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, may have also been an orc, but he may have also been one of the Nazgul, or something else altogether. Finally, we have Gorbag and Shagrat, who fought one another during the Battle of Cirith Ungol in 3019 of the Third Age. Shagrat slew Gorbag, and went to Sauron with Frodo's belongings. These are just some of the main orcs in the legendarium, and there are other named ones, especially in the expanded works, but we shall move on to the history of the orcs. Since the orcs were the main soldiers of Morgoth, Sauron, the Witch King, and Saruman, they took part in all of the wars that these four made on the Free Peoples. Some of the conflicts from the Years of the Trees and the First Age saw Morgoth's orcs, while the wars of the Second and Third Ages were the time of Sauron's orcs. The Angmar War in the Mid-Third Age and its surrounding events and the War of the Ring saw the Witch King's orcs, and the War of the Ring in the Late Third Age also showed Saruman's orcs. There were some battles and wars in Middle-earth, however, in which the orcs did not join, such as the Kinslayings or the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, but such wars were few indeed. Rare even were the times indeed when the orcs acted without any involvement from Morgoth, Sauron, the Witch King, or Saruman, for even Azog, who was slain in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, may have been sent to Moria by Sauron around the year 2480 of the Third Age, eventually leading to this war. It's possible that the goblins under Gulfimble at the Battle of Greenfields acted not in accordance with Sauron at all, but it is impossible to say for sure. In times without leaders amongst the Dark Lords, orcs posed a far lesser threat, and they took to harassing travelers or even one another. Even with leadership, sometimes the orcs would slay one another, as we saw in the Tower of Cirith Ungol with Frodo's mithril coat. The orcs would eventually be scattered or slain with the fall of Sauron, and while some orcs remained in Middle-earth, especially those in Moria before they were driven out by Durin the Seventh, they would ultimately never pose a true threat to the Free Peoples again, and it is likely that they were all wiped out, and the world was made safer. Thus, we come to the end of our tale about the Orcs of Middle-earth. From the Orcs of Middle-earth, we see the foul nature of war, and those who bring it and thrive in conflict and fear, even though the orcs were originally elves of good but fearful nature. We must ourselves never become warlike in nature, and in defeating evil, we must ourselves not become evil. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you all enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections on the Orcs of Middle-earth? I see them as abundant, but fearsome opponents that our heroes must overcome. Let me know your thoughts about that and the Goblin-Orc debate in the comments below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts there. Also, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for our podcast and Discord server. Links for those are in the description below. A huge shout out and thanks to our Valar tier patrons on Patreon, Adrian de la Tour, Chris Ortner, and Marseille. Thank you guys so much. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I will see you all again next week with an epic character history on the good and loyal dwarf Gimli, son of Gloween. Until then, thank you all so much for watching and for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.